Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Enhancing Safety, Understanding Updates to API RP 752, 753, and 756, presented by Joshua Bruce Black. BakerRisk has decades of experience completing incident investigations, loss prevention studies, testing and research, and risk management services. Today, we will discuss key updates to the RPs, including around the siting evaluation process and criteria, management of change and revalidation, expanded sections on fire and toxic hazards, and updated zoning methods and siting for essential, non-essential personnel in portable buildings and tents. Now, for today's webinar, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we have posted links in the chat to content related to our webinar subject. We invite you to explore BakerRisk's published papers, previous webinars, and BakerRisk Training Center courses. Second, we want to respond to your questions following this webinar, so please type the questions into the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel, and our presenter will respond to the questions. And finally, at the close of our webinar today, we ask that you provide feedback by responding to our short survey. And now for the webinar. BakerRisk presenter Joshua Bruce Black has experience leading facility siting studies, consequent and risk-based, business interruption risk analyses, pipeline and transportation risk assessments, hazardous area classification studies, and audits. He leads FSS and QRA training focused on inputs, methodology, analysis, results, and understanding and managing the results. Joshua also develops risk management guidelines, procedures, including leading and supporting a variety of companies with development of risk tolerance criteria, and is also a member of the API RP 752, 753, 756 Facility Siting Revision Committee and National Fire Protection Association 59A Technical Committee. We're excited to have Josh present this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Josh.
Thank you, Naomi. So the webinar today provides an overview of major changes to API RP 752, 753, and 756 specifically, and it does not provide an overview of these RPs themselves, but rather focuses on highlighting major differences between preceding and current editions. It's been a long journey, over 5 years to releasing these revised RPs, and a lot of effort and energy went into them from facility siting committee members. I was a member of the committee, but BakerRisk has several other staff that were committee members as well, including Ray Bennett, a senior principal structural engineer, and we have 2 staff members who represented their previous companies on the committee, Chris Buchwald and Greg Sapp. So this shows a quick overview of the webinar. So first, we'll talk about some general changes to the RPs. Then we're going to get into some specific sections, first on determination of buildings and tents requiring siting evaluation and changes to this section. Then look at changes to the siting evaluation process and criteria, followed by the management change and revalidation sections, and then look at changes to essential and non-essential personnel and the explosions and fire and toxic sections, and then ending with looking at a couple updates and changes to the annexes. So in general, overall, there is more guidance provided in the RPs. There are more tables and bulleted lists. The lists themselves have more examples, and there is additional information in the fire and toxic sections. There is now really strong alignment between API RP 752, 753, and 756. Some examples are things like the guiding principles. They have now taken the best guiding principles from each of the RPs, and they are consistent. There's also a section on relating guiding principles to hierarchy of controls in each of the RPs. All the definitions in the RPs are consistent between them, and there are some new definitions that have been added. to these RPs. And then all the sections, the names and the numbers are consistent between 752, 753, and 756. One of the changes, just in general, is that the fire and toxic shelter-in-place protection concept has been changed to be called refuge, which describes both a shelter-in-place or safe haven. And then there are changes to the API RP 73, 76 zone and essential personnel contours. Now, in general, things that are added are typically added as should statements, and some things are changed from should to shall. And just in general, there was a lot of discussion about combining the RPs, but at this time it was decided to keep them separate. So API RP 72 covers new and existing permanent buildings, and that's the same as before. And it also covers new and existing portable buildings other than lightwood trailers intended for perpetual use in a specific fixed location. Now, previously, APRP 72 covered portable buildings specifically designed to resist significant blast loads and intended for permanent use in a fixed location. So this is a change and an expansion from just, buildings designed to resist significant blast loads intended for permanent use in a fixed location to basically any portable building other than lightwood trailers intended for perpetual use in a specific fixed location. APRP 73 covers all portable buildings intended to be movable and all lightwood trailers. And then APRP 76 covers new and existing tents, just like it did before. And there is an annex in each of the RPs that's been added that shows which RP covers different structures, and that is shown here at the bottom right. So now looking at the determination of buildings and tents requiring siting evaluation section, the previous version of APRP 73 was released in 2007. And at that time, guidance was provided on portable buildings intended for occupancy, portable buildings not intended for occupancy, and other occupied portable structures. Subsequent versions of APRP 752 and 756 revised these categories into the four main categories basically you see here: intended for occupancy, not intended for occupancy, excluded structures, and evaluated for exclusions. And they also added more examples of buildings and tents under each of these categories. So this slide actually shows portable buildings that were not specifically listed in the previous version of API-RP 73, but are now listed in alignment with API-RP 752 and 756. And for buildings and tents that are excluded from the siting evaluation, the RP now states that owners and operators should consider the factors listed in the explosion, fire, and toxic additional consideration sections, which, is somewhat new to the RPs. In some of them, they had some additional consideration sections, but in some of them, they did not. And then under the buildings or tents not intended for occupancy, there is a new shall statement, which says controls shall be implemented to ensure that the use of these buildings and tents does not change to buildings and tents intended for occupancy. And so this really indicates that owners and operators need to have controls such as engineered and/or procedural safeguards like locks, signage, removing air conditioning, periodic audits, etc., on buildings and tents not intended for occupancy. And then lastly, one more thing to state here in this section is that now tents intended for occupancy, unless they fall under the excluded tents or evaluated for exclusion categories, shall be included in the tent siting evaluation, regardless of the duration of placement or occupancy. And so that statement, for the most part, was in the previous version of API-RP 76. But the new part is the regardless of the duration of placement or occupancy. And so that addition really emphasizes that you cannot use the rationale that the tent will only be located there for a week or only be occupied for a week or a short duration as a reason to exclude a tent from the siting evaluation. But moving on to the siting evaluation process and criteria sections, there is an updated building site evaluation process flowchart in API RP 72, and the additions are shown in the shaded color here, which are really around ensuring that the buildings are placed in accordance with the guiding principles, documenting the siting evaluation, and revalidating the siting evaluation periodically. The siting evaluation criteria for the consequence-based approach is really the same as the previous version of API RP 72, with some additions here shown on the right of the slide. Previously, the siting evaluation process criteria included things like blast load, thermal flux and exposure time, building damage, occupant vulnerability, etc. But instead of internal environment quality, which is shown here, this was previously called building internal environment degradation. And now they've actually, there's additional description on what this actually means. What does internal environment quality mean? So it's things like oxygen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide levels, air temperature, humidity, temperature of building surfaces, and smoke and/or other combustion products. And so these criteria on internal environment quality are really important for buildings with a toxic or fire refuge protection concept. These really are not that important if the protection concept is for immediate evacuation. And these criteria and identical criteria have now been added to API RP 73 and 756. So moving on to the siting evaluation process, a little more detail in 753 and 756. There was not previously a flowchart present in API 73, but one was present in API RP 76, and it has been slightly updated. And the flowcharts in API RP 73 and 756 are identical, except for the terminology of portable buildings and tents. And there are several new shell statements in the siting evaluation process section, which were not previously present in API RP 73. So those are that owners and operators shall determine and document occupancy restrictions for each building intended for occupancy. And so occupancy restrictions really means whether the tent or portable building is limited to essential personnel only, or it can contain non-essential personnel. And then determine if the portable building tent intended for occupancy under consideration could be impacted by an explosion, flammable vapor release, thermal radiation, or toxic material release. And for each of these hazard types that could impact the building or tent, a siting evaluation of the hazard shall be conducted and documented. And then there's a personnel competency section, which was present in the previous version of API RP 76, but has been updated in this revised version. It was not present in API RP 73. And the interesting thing here is that this section makes a distinction between personnel performing the evaluation and detailed analysis and people siting buildings and tents based on the criteria at site. So this change, in addition, clearly identifies that owners and operators may hire consultants or have internal SMEs that can perform and have the training to perform the siting evaluation or detailed analysis. And then they can have separate individuals, say on site or corporately, that are trained and have the necessary experience to use the siting evaluation, detailed analysis, contours, as well as the siting evaluation criteria to site portable buildings and tents according to their tolerance criteria. So a couple more points and changes around the siting evaluation process and criteria. One is that the siting evaluation method does not affect the determination of the occupancy restrictions or zoning restrictions. So what this means is that whether you're performing a consequence or risk-based approach does not affect the essential, non-essential, or zone 1, 2, 3 boundaries. So those are independent. Also, if performing a risk-based approach for a portable building intended for occupancy to establish the individual risk, the study shall assume the portable building tent to be occupied at least 40 hours a week by an individual for the entire year, and no credit shall be taken for cases where the portable building tent will not be used or located at the site for less than a year. Now, that 40 hours a week requirement was previously present in API RP 753, but was not in API RP 76. And so really this is focused on, for example, if you have a maximum individual risk tolerance criteria, that maximum exposure cannot be less than 40 hours a week for any portable building or tent. That's the minimum. And you cannot credit that portable building or tent will only be on site for, say, a month or a couple months of the year in your individual risk calculation. It also says if performing a risk-based approach for a portable building tent intended for occupancy to establish the aggregate risk, the expected occupancy hours and cumulative duration of usage may be considered. So unlike the individual risk comment above, for societal or aggregate risk, you can use the actual, man hours, total man hours in the building, and actually potentially whether that building is always there on an annual basis, for example. A couple other points: owners and operators shall establish siting evaluation criteria for new and existing portable buildings and tents consistent with the selected assessment approaches. So this shall requirement was not present in the previous version of API RP 73 and was a should statement in the previous version of API RP 76. So now it is a requirement that you also have siting evaluation criteria, consequence or risk-based for new and existing portable buildings and tents. And then lastly, the scenario selection process discussed in API RP 72 should be used for portable buildings and tents, but with the added considerations of where portable buildings and tents could be located and what hazards or risks to which they could be exposed. And so this just really highlights that if you are doing your facility siting study or siting evaluation for permanent buildings and focused specifically on maximum credible events for those permanent buildings, if you don't have permanent buildings, say, all over your site, in all of the locations that you might cite portable buildings or tents, that you may have missed identifying and assessing some maximum credible events at these different locations. So you would have to include those in your evaluation for portable buildings and tents. On the other hand, if you've done a comprehensive assessment of all of the hazards on site and all the maximum credible events around your entire site, then you can use those exactly in your assessment of portable buildings and tents. Moving on to the MOC and revalidation sections. The MOC section was previously present in API RP 72 and 756, but was not in API RP 73. And in API RP 72, there is one update and two additional situations that may require an MOC evaluation. The first bullet here is about the update, which just the update is especially during periods of increased risk, including but not limited to unit startup, testing, or planned shutdown operations. So that addition there at the end is an update. And then the new situations that have been added are the building status changes from temporary to permanent, which actually changes which RP the building is addressed in, and then adding an unoccupied building or structure that could cause a change in the potential for or severity of explosion, fire, or toxic material release impacts. That's focused on clarifying that unoccupied buildings or structures recognizes the fact that these may pose additional congestion and confinement on site or actually contain a hazard, even though they're unoccupied. And then MOC items in APRP 73 and 76 are the same as APRP 752, but with these 3 additions at the bottom. And then there is a new section on revalidation that's added to each of the RPs. And this section highlights that siting evaluations should be periodically revalidated and specifies what should be addressed in the revalidation. And the revalidation section is the same as API RP 72 with an additional sentence there at the bottom. If portable buildings intents are not explicitly included in the revalidated siting evaluation, then the placement should be verified against the revalidated hazards or risks. And many companies do already revalidate their siting evaluations on a periodic basis, in addition to updating them in alignment with the MOC process. And most often, I would say, you see siting evaluations revalidated on a 5-year basis in alignment with the PHA process. Looking at changes to the essential and non-essential personnel sections of API RP 753 and 756. So this is a new section on non-essential personnel and portable buildings intents and on citing restrictions for non-essential personnel. Now, API RP 73 did previously have a section on essential personnel and the use of portable buildings, but API RP 76 did not. And so it states that owners and or operators shall determine whether the personnel intended to occupy a portable building tent meet the definition of essential personnel for each applicable phase of plant operation, such as normal operation, startup, and plant shutdown. And it does also state that some personnel may be essential during one phase of operation and non-essential during another, and also that it's not dependent on whether the personnel work on site on a permanent or temporary basis. So again, just because you're essential for one phase of operation does not make you essential for every phase of operation. And if you're permanent, that does not mean you're essential necessarily. And whether you're temporary or there for a turnaround does not necessarily make you non-essential. The revised RPs also clarify that you cannot use a risk-based approach to redefine where non-essential personnel or light wood trailers can be located. And so you can see that at the bottom here in the slide. And previously, it could be interpreted that an owner-operator could redefine those zone boundaries based on consequence or risk. So this was explicitly clarified in the revised RPs that this is not acceptable. There is also a new flowchart for occupancy restrictions in portable buildings and tents, which is shown here on the right. And there is also an explanation on why portable buildings and tents have a distinction in siting of essential versus non-essential personnel, and permanent buildings do not. So that's an additional sentence or paragraph added to the RPs. So a little more information on the essential and non-essential personnel sections. So it does state that non-essential personnel shall not occupy portable buildings and tents within 330 feet of potential explosion or fire sources, which could impact the personnel in a building and tent at that location, regardless of the building and tent design, and located in Zone 1 for VCE. And the previous RPs stated that non-essential personnel could not be located in Zone 1. So that's still the same requirement. The new requirement is that non-essential personnel cannot be located within 330 feet of an explosion or fire source that can impact personnel in a building. So this is things like, for explosion source, this would be things like bursting pressure vessels, TNT scenarios, furnace firebox scenarios, things of that nature. And so this addition here, one recognizes that Standoff from external VCs is not the only hazard that could impact personnel in portable buildings and tents, and considering other explosion hazards, as well as flash fire, jet pool fires, is also important. And it also means that because of this addition, obviously, the location of essential and non-essential personnel is not coupled solely to the explosion zone boundary. And the location of where you can assign essential and non-essential personnel on your site may change. So again, this addition here could change where essential and non-essential personnel can be located. A couple more interpretations here is, again, one of the simplest and most conservative interpretation is that non-essential personnel are restricted 330 feet from all, again, explosion, other explosion scenarios, fire scenarios, or maximum credible events that have been assessed in the siting evaluation study. Or another potential interpretation is that an owner-operator can define a specific explosion fire impact criteria. So because it says which could impact the personnel in a building intent, potentially you could set this impact criteria, and if it's not met, you could cite non-essential personnel slightly closer than 330 feet with a maximum of 330 feet from explosion or fire sources. So moving on to the explosion section, there is an updated siting evaluation for explosion process flowchart. Additions shown in the shaded colors, again, pretty much the same type of additions as with the other flowcharts. In addition, there is a previous section on factors influencing the potential for VCEs. And now it mentions that non-process congestion and confinement can also influence the severity of a VCE, and provides examples including rail cars and vehicles, dense vegetation, spaces beneath elevated structures and substations, and buildings that allow ingress. And so it's clearly recognized in the new RPs that non-process congestion and confinement can affect vapor cloud explosions and should be included in facility siting evaluations. And APRP 73 and 756 specifically include non-process congestion and confinement in their definitions for zone boundaries as well. So in the explosion building assessment section, there's also a couple of changes or additions. The previous version of APRP 72 mentioned types of debris hazards associated with explosion occupant vulnerability, and the revised version provides a bulleted list and includes 3 additional debris hazards shown in red here. So thrown doors or windows, mechanical equipment, and fragments from shattered windows. There's also a new section which allows explosion testing in lieu of or in support of detailed structure analysis to establish the response of a building or their components to blast loading. This was previously present in APRP 756 for tents, but was not previously shown in APRP 72 or 753. If you recall, there was also a previous paragraph in APRP 72 discussing buildings of brittle construction specifically. And now another section has been added on buildings constructed by the assembly of self-framing panels, stating that they could have inferior performance under blast loading to that of lightweight trailers, described in APRP 753. And the evaluation of buildings constructed of self-framing panels is at best based on static or dynamic testing or detailed structural analysis of the specific panels and connections. And so this just is added in recognition that there's a lot of variability in buildings constructed as self-framing panels. Some of them could be quite strong, while others could be quite weak. So using a simplified model for these buildings may not be the best approach, and it really should be assessed based on a detailed analysis or testing. And then there's an additional explosion considerations section when siting buildings, which is new to APRP 72 and 756, but something similar was already present in APRP 73. And there's now a list of 9 different items for additional considerations, and 2 of those are shown here around the effect of stacking portable modules and orientation of the building. So I've added a video here to give you a brief break from hearing me talk and to highlight a couple things. One, this is an example of building explosion testing, and 2, it highlights potential vulnerability or lack of vulnerability from non-structural debris hazards, specifically around building contents located on or against or near external walls in different structures and their associated building response level. And these, again, buildings are the same blast load, of course, is applied to the buildings, and all the structure and the internal equipment is the same. It's just kind of reversed, but it's the same connection, same internal equipment inside the buildings. So moving on to the citing for external VCs section in APRP 753 and 756. So this is a new flow chart. The same flow chart is there for portable buildings and for tents in APRP 73 and 756. And it describes 2 different zoning methods, method A and method B. And zoning method A was previously referred to as a simplified method. So it's pretty much the same as that. And zoning method B is somewhat new or different. And so to show a little more detail about these zoning methods, method A applies to external VCs only, and it applies to congested volumes less than 1 million cubic feet. And the zone boundary figure shown at the bottom here, again, very much the same between the simplified method previously and method A, again, has not really changed. The main clarifications here are that method A limits the zone 1 boundary to a minimum of 330 feet, regardless of the size of the congested volume. And that's why it says at the bottom there, 0 to 7,500 cubic feet. So again, minimum of 330 feet from congested volumes, and it's from both process and non-process area congested volumes. So the previous RPs did not specifically discuss non-process area congestion. So this is an addition. And potentially, if you could show that flammables can't reach some of this non-process area congestion, then that could be omitted from these zone boundary contours. Another clarification is that method A cannot be used for congested volumes over 1 million cubic feet, which could have been previously inferred, but I don't think it was specified previously. On the other hand, method B applies to all explosion hazards, so external and internal VCAs, bursting pressure vessels, TNTs, etc. It applies to any congested volume size, including greater than 1 million cubic feet. And here it utilizes a curve-based method, or CFD, to predict the 0.9 and 0.6 PSI contours based on the congested volumes. And 0.9 PSIG represents the zone 1-2 boundary, 0.6 represents zone 2, the zone 2-3 boundary, with a minimum of 330 feet offset from process area congested volumes that are greater than 7,500 cubic feet. And then zone 1, 2, and zone 2, 3 boundaries from process area congested volumes less than 7,500 cubic feet and non-process area congested volumes may be based on the 0.9 and 0.6 psi free field overpressure contours with no minimum offset. And then owners operators should still maintain documentation of the basis of the congested volume assessment approach and the predicted 0.9 and 0.6 psig contours. And just a couple key points to cover here on these explosion zoning methods. One is that what's important, the potential explosion hazards. So whether at your site you have external and internal VCEs, BPVs, and TNTs. If you just have external VCEs, again, you could use method A, but if you have some of these other hazards on site, you need to use method B here. Also, what are the maximum credible events at the site? So defining this is going to be somewhat important as it could change, how far your extents, say your 0.9 and 0.6 psig contours go. Whether congestion on site is process versus non-process area congestion, because it's process area congestion, you have that minimum 330 feet offset, whereas non-process area congestion does not. And you can use the 0.9 and 0.6 psig contours. And then the size of the congested volume is also important. So less than 7,500 cubic feet, again, you can use the 0.9 and 0.6 psig contours. And over 1 million cubic feet, you need to use method B and not method A. So moving on to the fires section, there is an updated siting evaluation for fires process flow chart. And again, additions shown in the shaded color. The fire section still allows the spacing table approach, but includes some additional cautions around looking at the basis of those spacing tables and the purpose of the spacing tables. So just a couple more cautions. So previously, APRP 72 had a section on factors influencing potential and types of fires, but it was very short, only a couple of sentences. Now it's quite expanded and includes these 2 new tables here on types of fires, from ignitable releases, and influential mitigation measures on fire size and duration. In the fire effects on building section, this is an updated table. More information has been added in terms of the fire types. The fireball has been added, and then flash fire and internal flash fire VC have been separated. And there's more effects shown, including pressure and momentum in this table. And previously, this section mentioned that fireballs and flash fires outside buildings are typically short duration events and not normally considered in building siting evaluation studies. And now it has been updated, and the new text is shown in red here. And so while there's no additional requirement here, it does show and recognize that fireballs and flash fires can be hazardous to evacuating personnel. So there was a section on fire effects on buildings in the previous version of APRP 72, and it mentioned that building occupant vulnerability from fire may result from the following effects. And so that list now includes 2 additional effects shown in red here: formation of smoke and fumes inside the building from degradation of building components and ignition of building envelopes or contents. And on the right, there is a new table added on building consequences associated with fire types. And in the next slide, I have added one other video break here to highlight one of the immediate effects of jet fires to building occupants, which is the failure of windows here. So just highlighting that jet fires can break windows very quickly, immediate effect for just typical windows in a building. So now moving to the toxic section, there is an updated siting evaluation for toxics process flowchart as well, additions shown in the shaded color there. And then there's some new additions to the toxic section on the right here I wanted to highlight. So the first one is that siting evaluation is required for an acute level of concern, and it states ERPG 3, AGL 3, or equivalent. And so APRP 73 previously defined ERPG 3 as an acute level of concern, but API RP 76 and 752 did not specify what acute level of concern here is. So now all of them specify this as the acute level of concern and actually offer AGL 3 as well, which has different durations defined for that. So you could specify say a 10 or 30 or 60-minute duration associated with AGLs. There's also a third protection concept, which is the combination of a toxic refuge and evacuation. And unique protection concepts may be selected for each toxic material impacting a building. So this means that for one, if you have multiple toxins, for one toxin, you could choose to refuge from that hazard, while for the other toxin or for another toxin, you could evacuate as your protection concept. Toxic refuges can be entire buildings or designated rooms or portions of buildings, and then owners and operators should specify toxic refuges to be either safe haven or shelter-in-place locations. And around the toxic and fire protection concepts, I'm going to kind of cover them in parallel because of the alignment and how closely aligned they are. But first, just a couple comments about the evacuation fire protection concept. This concept is now stated that it's the preferred response for building occupants, and fire refuges should only be implemented in cases where evacuation is not possible or operationally feasible, and you consider immediate effects from fire and time-dependent effects. So, when you're looking at delayed evacuation, either due to emergency response actions, site procedures, or building impairment, look at the time-dependent effects from the fire as well. So in the toxic protection concept for evacuation, there are two types, again, immediate and delayed evacuation. And the previous version of APRP 752 stated that owners and operators shall provide the following emergency response features, and now includes three more features in red. So means for occupants to communicate with emergency responders, means for occupancy to determine wind direction, and plan to account for occupants. And the PPE feature, which is also the mitigation measure one there, is slightly expanded and updated to be more comprehensive. And the same features are listed for the evacuation protection concept for fires and toxics. The only difference really is the wording of fire and toxic, and for fires, they also have shielding as a mitigation measure. And I would say a lot of owners, operators already include these additional items here in their emergency response plan or strategy. So it may not have a major effect on different sites or companies, but if you don't, you should add these emergency response features to your evacuation protection concept. For the fire and toxic refuge protection concept, previously APRP 72 stated that fire SIPs shall have features to prevent infiltration and formation of smoke or flammable mixtures inside a building, and actually directed you to the toxic SIP section. That requirement on preventing infiltration and formation of smoke is still there, but now owners and operators may specify a fire refuge to be either a safe haven or shelter-in-place location, and should consider providing the following items here. So all of these are technically new to the fire section because it just directed you to the toxic section. Now, previously APRP 72 in the toxic section did list 5 features that owners and operators should consider providing for toxic refuges. And so now there's 3 additional items in that section, which are in red here. Instructions for evaluating the atmosphere within the fire toxic refuge and actions to be taken if those limits or internal environment quality criteria are exceeded, sufficient volume of air to meet internal environment quality, and guidance for sheltering personnel to put the building into shelter mode. And again, basically the same list in fires and toxics here. It's really the same list. So there's also performance requirements in the fire refuge protection concept. Previously, it stated that performance requirements for these features shall be designed, assessed based on the length of time occupants are required to remain in the refuge and the length of time that the flammable material or fire impedes the refuge. Those requirements are still there, but now there are additional performance requirements that should be accounted for in the design of the fire refuge. And those are listed here on the left. And then it also states, it has some additional should statements about assessing fire escalation potential and accounting that for the design in the design of the fire refuge or the emergency response plan in terms of evacuation, and considering potential for explosion damage on your fire refuge. For the toxic refuge protection concept, previously, again, stated something similar about designing and assessing toxic refuges based on the length of time occupants are required to remain in the building and length of time that the toxic material impedes escape from the building. So those are shown in this list in the blue or black color. And now, instead of saying, may be designed or assessed, this has been changed to should, and provides additional performance requirements in red. So these 5 items in red are additions, and it also states non-structural damage may compromise the building effectiveness as a toxic refuge. So you want to consider that as well. There is a new section in APRP 72 on fire and toxic additional considerations, which provides a list of risk reduction measures that should be considered. And I've shown that here. The red ones are for the fire section, the black ones or blue ones or dark blue are the toxic, and then the orange are applied to both the fire and toxic sections. And then there are new shall statements. So owners and operators shall inform personnel occupying buildings and tents of the use policies and procedures, the plan in the event of an external fire or toxic release, and if other hazards in the vicinity could impact the building and tent occupants. Emergency plan details for the facility shall be posted in the building and tent, and where there's risk from an adjacent process plant area, the emergency alarm shall be audible within the building and tent. So all of those are new shall statements really focused on an emergency response planning. And then there are additional considerations also in API RP 73 and 76. The explosion and fire additional considerations were previously present in API RP 73 and 76, but these items here are some of the additions to these sections. So again, you can look over those. And then in the toxic additional consideration sections, this was not present previously in APRP 73, and there were only 2 bullets in APRP 76. So this is much more comprehensive now, also showing and recognizing the difference in the design of portable buildings and tents versus permanent buildings. So it highlights some of those differences in these additional considerations. There are new API informative annexes in the RPs. These are the ones in 752. I'll highlight that there is one on typical building protection features for flammable and toxic refuge buildings. So what's the difference between safe havens versus shelter-in-place locations? And there are also new informative annexes in APRP 73 and 756. Again, highlighting one of those is examples of essential personnel. So showing for different phases of operation, which roles may be essential versus not essential, as an example. So I know that was a lot of information. A couple, I guess, takeaways or summaries. A lot of additional information. Again, new definitions, new information in the bodies, a lot of new great information in the annexes. There's great alignment between 752, 753, and 756. So it's very easy to go back and forth between the RPs. And there's also alignment with APRP 751 with the terminology of the toxic refuges and the safe havens versus shelter-in-place locations. There is a change in essential and zone contours, and you do need siting evaluation criteria for portable buildings and tents. And there is additional guidance and requirements for the fire and toxic protection concepts that wasn't there previously. And with that, I know that was a lot of information, but I will turn it over to questions.
Yes, and thank you, Josh, for your presentation. But before we dive into those questions, we do have a special guest joining us today. So I'd like to go ahead and welcome Jeff Todd. He's a process safety manager for Holly Frontier, and he's also the API Facility Siting Study Revision Committee Chair. And so I'm going to ask him to go ahead and share a few words. So thank you, Jeff, for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can. Thank you.
Okay, again, just want to give thanks to Josh and the fabulous BakerRisk boys for putting this presentation together. I was working on one for my company, and this one here is very good. I recommend that you share it. As Josh mentioned, back in 2018, it was recognized that the 3 facility siting standards needed to be updated. In fact, 2 of them were already past the 5-year window for the ANSI process for revalidation. So we kicked off had a kickoff meeting in September 2018, actually at the BakerRisk offices in San Antonio, and we had a large assortment of industry consultants, others on the team, some 40 plus people at one point. And what we found out quickly is that with 40 plus people, you get 40 plus different interpretations of how what the language is telling you. So we had to work through a lot of that, try to make sure everybody had their say, and had the it wasn't any one company that overrode everybody else. It was a consensus effort. Took us quite a while to get these things where there was alignment between the 3 RPs, which there are now. Maybe in the next revision round, it'll just go to one document. But again, there's a lot of things that we covered. A lot of questions came up that one company had seen something nobody else had seen. So it was a great sharing of information, which resulted in the documents that you have now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. So I am going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that did come up during the presentation. And just a reminder to all of our attendees, if you've not already done so, we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. That's been disabled. So type any questions that you have. First question, Josh. So how is BakerRisk updating the recommended FSS QRA methodologies and software to address changes in API RP 752, 753, and 756?
Yeah, so I would say the primary change BakerRisk is incorporating into, say, our software, our consequence software safe site, is updating APRP 73, 76 zone and essential personnel contour analysis to be able to perform this updated method B easily and efficiently. In terms of some methodology changes, for example, when we know there are fire refuges on site. We will recommend assessing, say, levees and fireballs from pressurized storage and rail cars. And we're also recommending things like exclusion of non-process area congestion and quantitative testing of leak tightness of toxic refuges, especially toxic safe havens in FSS QRAs. However, I would say, these last two are examples of some things we've already been recommending to clients prior to the release of the new RPs. So it's just more emphasis now in the new RPs.
Perfect. Another question that came up was API RP 752 references non-structural debris as an occupant vulnerability hazard. How can or is this incorporated into a facility siting study?
Yeah, so yeah, obviously when a building is loaded by blast, the exterior walls and roof will flex. There will be displacement, and then in response to this flexion motion, content such as desks, bookshelves, and monitors may be thrown into occupied spaces of the building, and so the vulnerability assessed in an FSS QRA is primarily due to damage of the structural components. And I would say there can be great variation in non-structural hazards. What is placed on walls, how it's secured, what's the mass or weight of these objects, as well as personnel proximity to these hazards. So these things are highly variable, so are not taken into account a lot of times in great detail in your baseline facility siting studies, I would say. But to assess this type of debris hazards, say from equipment, windows, doors, things like that, BakerRisk recommends and has performed audits for things like interior components in buildings that could be loaded by a blast wave in an accidental explosion. And this audit basically will transition into an evaluation phase where the interior contents that pose a vulnerability threat to interior occupancy can be identified and then mitigated either prescriptively or with engineered solutions or connections. And so again, just to highlight, I would say this evaluation and type of mitigation phase on non-structural debris hazards is typically completed as a follow-on to a baseline facility siting study.
Perfect. And it looks like we're kind of running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one last question before we conclude. We have stacked modular portable buildings at our facility, which form a two-story complex. How is this incorporated into a facility siting study?
Yeah, so one, I would say it really depends on, I guess, is this modular portable building, is it considered in a fixed location and going to be there for an indefinite time, such that it kind of falls under API RP 752, or is it a portable structure that is intended to be movable and fall under API RP 73? So that would be one of my first questions. And then it also depends on the scope of the facility siting study. So if the scope is focused on permanent buildings only, and you're not really focused on portable buildings, then this may not be included in that assessment. If you have included assessment of portable buildings, it may be something like developing the contours, the zone contours, and the exclusion contours, essential personnel contours, which again is just providing you information to then use in your evaluation of and site portable buildings and tents. And so that may not be covered there. And then if you did actually cover this building in the scope of your FSS, so it is part of the assessment, whether it's a permanent building or portable building, really the focus, I think, in typical facility siting studies would be on the assessment of these modular buildings, the structural capacity of them individually, as a module? How can they, are they designed for explosions, and what kind of explosions are they designed for? And the, the analysis of actually, displacement or sliding, tipping and connection requirements really necessitates a detailed analysis. So that's not typically performed in a baseline facility siting study. And you would need a detailed assessment, which would take into account things like, the height of the modules, the anchorage, any gaps between the modules, things like that, anchorage to the foundation, to really get into the details of how a stacked modular building behaves in an explosion.
Perfect. Well, Josh, it looks like we've covered only a few of the questions that were asked. So to the attendees, if you have any additional questions, again, type those into the Q&A box, and we are going to have Josh answer these questions, and we'll send that recording via email or newsletter with links to the recorded webinar, slides from his presentation, and then the answered questions. And then as a final reminder to everyone, today's webinar, again, is going to be posted to our website as well. And once a recording is available, you'll receive that email from us with the link. And again, appreciate your attendance, and complete the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.